She was a great mother the whole way. She was a tough girl, and I really,
It's arguments and threats, and as the hunt for her continues, detectives will realize they have been sitting across Mengqi's killer this entire time.
Should I ask them to deport you?
What's really going on here, Joe? The truth about what happened to Mengqi is going to come out, but we're not going to stop.
I really miss her. She was a great mother. On camera, Joseph Elledge spoke about his missing wife, Mengqi Ji, in the past tense, even as he insisted she would come home soon. The graduate student had vanished from their Columbia, Missouri apartment. No goodbye, no explanation. Joseph was the last person to see her alive. He had driven somewhere that October night, but where? And why was he already speaking as if she would never return? Investigators would soon realize the answer lay buried in the one place Joseph claimed held only happy memories. To understand how it came to this, we need to go back to when Mengqi first came to Missouri. Mengqi Ji arrived in Columbia, Missouri in 2012 with a student visa and a mechanical engineering textbook she'd already read cover to cover. She was 21 years old, born in China and already fluent in the language of precision calculus, thermodynamics, structural analysis. The kind of student who didn't just pass exams, she made other students wonder if they'd chosen the wrong major. At the University of Missouri, she didn't just excel, she dominated. While classmates struggled through problem sets, Mengqi worked 3 steps ahead, her pencil moving across graph paper with the confidence of someone who'd already solved the equation in her head. Professors noticed. They always do when someone that sharp walks into a room. By 2015, she'd graduated with honours and was immediately hired, not after a long job search, not after months of applications, immediately. The professor who hired her would later tell colleagues exactly why. She was such an overachiever. I wanted her on the team. To her colleagues, she was simply the best engineer in the room. Quiet, focused, methodical. The one who caught errors no one else saw. The one who stayed late not because she had to, but because she wanted the work done right. She kept a private diary, written in Chinese, tucked in her desk drawer. No one at the office could read it. No one asked to. She was building a future, one calculation at a time, unaware how short that future would be. Columbia, Missouri, wasn't Beijing. It was smaller, slower, landlocked. But it offered something she couldn't get back home. A degree that opened doors. A career in a field where precision mattered more than politics. She adapted. Learned the rhythms of Midwestern politeness, the unspoken rules of American office culture, made a life in a place that would never fully feel like home, but wasn't supposed to. It was a launching pad, not a destination. She was methodical about everything: her studies, her career, her future. That's what made what came next so inexplicable. In 2016, 25 years old, established in her career, fluent in 2 languages and a 3rd language of differential equations. She married a man who was, by every account, well below her level. Joseph Elledge was 20 years old, still in college, no degree, no career, no clear direction. While Mengqi had spent 4 years becoming indispensable in her field, he'd spent them existing. The gap wasn't subtle. It was a chasm. Education, ambition, maturity, earning potential, every metric pointed the same direction. Friends noticed, colleagues wondered. Her mother, who would fly from China for the wedding, must have seen it too. But Mengqi married him anyway. That gap, the space between who she was and who he was, between what she'd built and what he'd barely started, would come to define everything that followed. Every argument, every moment of control, every entry in the diary she kept in a language he couldn't read. The gap was always there, from the beginning. Not a warning sign, a fault line. 3 years after the wedding, the gap was still there, wider, quieter, more dangerous. By October 2019, they had a 1-year-old daughter named Anna. Joseph had finally finished his degree. Mengqi was still the overachiever. He was still catching up. The massage had already been going for 20 minutes when he finally asked the question. Tuesday evening, October 9th, 2019, just after 9 o'clock. Their apartment bedroom in Columbia, Missouri, was dimmed to the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Joseph Elledge, 24, a mechanical engineering student whose wife had quietly surpassed him in every measure that mattered, pressed his palms along Mengqi's shoulders in slow, deliberate strokes. "Who are you meeting tomorrow morning?" Mengqi didn't turn her head. "Me." Just that. One word. Not a name, not an explanation. Joseph kept massaging. The rhythm didn't break. But 5 minutes later, the question came back. "Who are you meeting tomorrow morning?" "Me." The same answer, the same tone, no elaboration, no irritation. She offered it like a wall, smooth, immovable, designed to stop the conversation exactly where it was. He asked a third time. By then, the massage had stretched to nearly half an hour, longer than usual. His hands worked her neck, her spine, the small of her back. It looked like intimacy. Or maybe it was something else. An attempt to extend the evening, to keep her in the room, to pull an answer she wasn't willing to give. "Who are you meeting tomorrow morning?" "Me." 3 questions, 1 answer. She never wavered. It was the kind of silence married people mistake for peace, until it becomes something else entirely. Mengqi had been distant for weeks. Friends would later say she'd been considering leaving quietly, researching divorce lawyers, documenting incidents in the diary she kept in Chinese. The marriage had been unraveling for longer than anyone outside the apartment knew. But inside, in moments like this, it could still look ordinary. A husband giving his wife a massage, a wife preparing for bed. Until you listen to what wasn't being said. At 9:30, earlier than usual. Mengqi rolled away from him and asked him to turn off the light. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, the way someone ends a conversation they're done having. Joseph reached for the lamp and clicked it off. The room went dark. Anna was already asleep in her crib down the hall. The apartment settled into the kind of silence that sounds like the end of a normal day. By morning, Mengqi was gone. Not gone as in left for work early. Not gone as in stepped out to meet a friend. Gone in the way that would trigger a missing person investigation, a months-long search, and eventually a body recovered from woods where someone thought no one would ever look. What happened in the hours between the light going off and the sun coming up would become the most contested question in the case. Joseph would have an answer, eventually. But on that Tuesday night, as the bedroom went dark and Mengqi turned away from him for the last time, the only sound was breathing, his, hers, and the clock on the wall counting down. Anna's crying woke him at 5 in the morning. loud enough to pull him out of sleep before he'd fully registered why. Joseph reached across the bed, hand searching for Mengqi in the dim light filtering through the bedroom window. His palm met cool fabric. Empty sheet. Anna, barely a year old, was crying loud enough to wake him from the other room. He sat up, blinking against the pre-dawn grey of October 10th, 2019, Wednesday morning. The apartment was quiet except for the baby's wails. He checked the bathroom. Empty. The living room. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. Mengqi was gone. But her phone sat charging on the nightstand. Her passport was in the drawer, her wallet on the dresser, cards and cash inside. Her wedding ring in its small dish beside the lamp, exactly where she'd placed it before sleep. Keep those details in mind. A woman doesn't leave for work without her phone, doesn't leave the country without her passport, doesn't leave her life without her wedding ring. These aren't things someone forgets. They're things someone takes when planning to come back, or things left behind when someone doesn't leave on their own terms. Joseph stood in the bedroom, looking at the evidence scattered across the furniture. Anna's crying grew more insistent. He walked to her room, picked her up, carried her to the kitchen. He opened the cabinet, found the formula, something he wasn't used to preparing.
I just asked her who she's talking to, and she says it's her mom. And
Joseph sat in the studio lights, carefully composed. He wore what a worried husband would wear. Plain shirt, neutral expression, just enough distress to read as genuine without being theatrical. He answered each question with the right tone, the right cadence, but he couldn't get the grammar right. She was a great mother the whole way, he told the camera, his voice steady. I really miss her, and I need her back. Was, not is. Past tense for someone he claimed to believe would return. The interviewer moved to the next question, asking about their life together, about what kind of person Mengqi was, present tense. The way you ask about someone who's still out there somewhere. Joseph kept answering in the past. She was dedicated. She was smart. She was the kind of person who always made sure everything was done right. Thus. He talked about her work ethic, her attention to detail, her devotion to Anna. Every sentence framed in the language of someone who no longer exists in the present. Not, she is dedicated. Not, she's the kind of person. Every verb pointing backward, away from now, towards something finished. Then, as if catching himself, he pivoted. I think she'll come back, but I hope she's safe. Anna needs to see her mum. Future tense to paper over the past. A correction that came too late, landed too hollow. Linguists study the language of deception, the patterns that emerge when someone tries to hide what they know. One of the most reliable tells is tense. People who genuinely believe someone is alive speak in present tense. She is. She does. She needs. People who know otherwise slip into past tense before they realize what they've revealed. She was. Never she is. The interview continued. Joseph talked about wanting her home, about how much he missed her, about how hard it was to explain to Anna why her mother wasn't there. All the right sentiments delivered with all the wrong verbs. The interviewer thanked him. The segment would air that evening. A husband pleading for his wife's safe return, asking the community to help bring her home. But detectives watching that interview caught the same slip he couldn't hear in his own voice. the past tense woven through every description of who Mengqi was not, is, not will be again, but was. The grammar of someone who already knows the story's ending. It was enough to bring him in for a very different kind of conversation, one where the cameras wouldn't be sympathetic and the questions wouldn't stop at what he wanted people to believe. Before that conversation could happen, someone had to force Joseph to make the call he should have made a day and a half earlier. Joseph sent the first text 30 minutes after John Wen knocked on his door asking where Mengqi was. Jean Wen, Mengqi's friend, was the first to insist something was wrong. She'd tried reaching Mengqi for days, texts unanswered, calls going straight to voicemail. When she finally showed up at the apartment, she asked the questions Joseph had been avoiding. "Where is she? When did you last see her?" Joseph gave vague answers. He wasn't sure. She'd been gone a few days. He thought she'd come back. He'd been waiting for a day and a half, while his wife's phone sat charging in their bedroom. Jean didn't buy it. She pressed. Where had Mengqi gone? Who had she been with? Had Joseph called anyone? Had he called the police? No, he hadn't. Only after Jean stood in his doorway demanding answers did Joseph pull out his phone and start texting. A wide circle of contacts, friends, acquaintances, anyone who might have seen Mengqi. The messages went out quickly, efficiently, the kind of digital footprint someone creates when they need to look like they're doing something. But he stayed on the couch. 30 minutes of texting before he stood up to actually go anywhere. 30 minutes of typing before he stepped outside to look for his wife. When he finally did leave, he drove around Colombia, claiming to search for Jean Wen's home. Maybe Mengqi was there. He circled streets he already knew, checking addresses that didn't need checking. Meanwhile, the real search was happening without him. Mengqi's mother, calling from China, where she'd returned after helping with Anna's birth, pressed every contact she had for news of her daughter. She called friends, colleagues, anyone who might know where Mengqi had gone. The calls came at odd hours, China's daytime, Missouri's night. Urgent questions in 2 languages, a mother's instinct refusing to accept silence. None of Mengqi's friends had heard from her. Her workplace hadn't seen her. Her phone hadn't pinged a tower. Her bank showed no activity. John Wen went door to door, knocked on neighbors' apartments, asked if anyone had seen Mengqi leaving, heard anything unusual, noticed anything out of place. She called hospitals, checked police reports, did the work someone who actually believes their friend is in danger would do, while Joseph sat sending texts. The contrast was stark. On one side, a mother in China burning up international phone lines. A friend canvassing the neighborhood on foot. 2 women who understood that someone doesn't vanish without their phone, passport, wallet, and wedding ring unless something is catastrophically wrong. On the other side, a husband who'd waited 36 hours to tell anyone his wife was gone, who spent half an hour texting before standing up, who drove in circles looking for addresses he already knew. It was only after Jean showed up at the apartment asking questions Joseph couldn't deflect that he finally called the police. The 911 call he should have made when he woke to an empty bed and a charged phone still waiting on the nightstand. The call that would start a very different clock ticking. That different clock brought Joseph to a police interview room where every answer opened a new question he couldn't close. The detective had been listening for 20 minutes when Joseph said the thing he couldn't take back. The detective sat across from Joseph and listened to every word, cataloguing each contradiction. The room was small, windowless, a table between them, a recorder running. Joseph sat in the chair meant for people who have something to explain. He explained. Mengqi Ji had been distant. They'd been having problems. She might have needed space. He'd woken up and she was gone. Phone still on the nightstand, passport in the drawer, wallet on the dresser. But he thought she'd left on her own, just walked out. The door was unlocked, Joseph added, as if that proved something. The detective paused, let the silence stretch, then asked the question Joseph should have anticipated. If she walked out, how would she lock the door behind her without the keys? Joseph's answer came slower this time. I don't know. Maybe she didn't lock it. But you said the door was unlocked when you found her gone, so someone had to unlock it. If she locked it on her way out, she'd need the keys. If she left it unlocked, anyone could have walked in. Which was it? Joseph shifted. I guess she just left it unlocked. The detective made a note, didn't press further. Let Joseph sit with the hole in his own story. Because the logic didn't work. A woman leaves without her phone, wallet, passport, wedding ring, but takes time to lock the door. That requires keys. Keys, Joseph said, were still inside. Or she doesn't lock it. Leaves it open. Leaves her 1-year-old daughter sleeping in an unlocked apartment with a father who won't notice she's gone for hours. Walks out into October dawn with no money, no identification, no way to call for help. Keys inside, door locked, phone on the nightstand, wife gone. The math didn't add up, and Joseph had been the one to bring it up, volunteered the detail about the door as if it supported his theory, not realizing it dismantled it. The detective moved to the next question. When exactly had Joseph last seen Mengqi Ji? What time did he go to sleep? What time did he wake up? The timeline questions Joseph had already fumbled in the texts. The television interview. Every version of the story. Each answer landed slightly different from the last. 9:30 became 9:15, became around 9. The massage lasted 20 minutes. Then half an hour. Then, I'm not sure how long. Small variations that wouldn't matter if someone was trying to remember. Large enough to matter if someone was trying to construct. The detective noted every shift, every hedge, every detail Joseph added and then couldn't support. If Mengqi had truly walked out on her own, she would have needed a way back in to reach her infant daughter. She would have needed keys to lock the door. She would have needed her phone to call for a ride. She would...
And Hannah kept looking outside, looking out the window, and I thought that was pretty nice. She was just checking everything out. I thought it was probably pretty good.
The same clearing where, years earlier, he'd knelt in the leaves and asked her to marry him. A beginning and an ending in the same soil. A proposal and a burial, separated by time, but connected by intent. The place he'd chosen to start their life together had become the place he'd tried to end, the evidence of what he'd done to her. For months, investigators had searched. For months, the forest had kept her. Missing, then found. The words that change everything about a case. What had been a question, where is she, became a certainty. What had been speculation, did he kill her, became something that required proof. The scene told part of the story. Shallow grave, remote location. No attempts to hide it beyond leaves and earth. Either Joseph had believed no one would find this clearing, or he'd run out of time to do more than the minimum. The body's condition would tell forensics more. Time of death, cause of death. Whether the injuries matched the story Joseph had been selling about Mengqi leaving voluntarily. But the most important witnesses weren't human. They surrounded the grave in a ring of bark and roots. Silent for 5 months, about to become the most damning evidence in the case. Juniper trees, specific to this region, specific to this park. Each one carrying its own genetic signature, as unique as a fingerprint. Grown into wood and branch and the needles that fell to the forest floor. The trees around Mengqi's grave would turn out to be the only witnesses that couldn't lie. Each one carried a DNA profile that could be matched, traced, connected to any piece of plant material that had travelled away from this clearing. And Joseph had walked among them, had stood where the hiker now stood, had left this place thinking the forest would keep his secret. But forests don't keep secrets, they just hold them until someone knows where to look. Proving he'd walked among those trees required connecting the forest to the man who'd claimed he'd never been there. The forensic scientist placed the boot under magnification and adjusted the light to see what had travelled out of the forest. Item 47. The boots seized weeks earlier, now critical evidence. The forensic scientist processing them had worked hundreds of cases, but had never seen a tree serve as a witness quite like this. With Mengqi's body recovered, every seized item had to be re-examined. The boots went from routine to essential. Under magnification, the tread came into sharp focus. Mud, dust, wear patterns, and then, caught deep in the grooves, something else. Plant material, multiple fragments, needle-like, pressed into the tread at depth suggesting they'd been walked on, ground in by weight. The scientist made notes. Plant material consistent with Juniperus virginiana, multiple fragments, boot tread depth 4 to 7 millimeters. The same species that ringed Mengqi's grave. Between the needles and the match, everything would change. Before we reveal what the DNA test showed, if you're still here with us, comment A or B. Do you think the boot evidence will be enough to convict Joseph? Add one reason why or why not. Please note what follows includes some recreated laboratory details for narrative purposes. DNA extraction from plant material follows the same principles as any genetic analysis. Every living thing carries a unique genetic signature. Trees are no exception. Each one carries DNA variations that make it individually identifiable, like a fingerprint grown from bark. The scientist extracted DNA from the juniper needles in Joseph's boot, sent it for sequencing, compared it against samples from trees surrounding the grave. The report came back with certainty forensic science rarely delivers. DNA profile match confirmed. Source: Juniperus virginiana. Specimen collected at scene marker 7, adjacent to burial site. Not just any juniper tree, not just any tree from that park. One specific tree, standing exactly where Joseph would have stood if he'd been in that clearing, digging in that soil, covering what he'd left behind. The tree didn't need to see him. It only needed to touch his boot. When he walked away thinking he'd left nothing behind, he'd carried the forest with him. Microscopic, invisible unless someone looked through a lens powerful enough to see what couldn't be washed away. Nature had testified where recordings and threats could not. The boot proved Joseph had been there. The DNA proved exactly where. Not somewhere in the park. Not on a trail. Standing beside the tree that grew over his wife's grave. Every story he'd told the 5-hour drive to relax. The search for places Mengqi might have gone. The confusion about where she could be collapsed under what his boot had carried into the evidence room. He'd been exactly where he'd always claimed he'd never been. Standing in the clearing where he'd proposed. Standing beside the tree that would become the witness he never saw coming. Standing over the grave he'd dug for the woman who'd once said yes. That single match placed Joseph exactly where he'd always claimed he'd never been. Standing beside the tree that grew over his wife's grave. Now investigators had to make him hear it. Making him hear it required bringing him back to the room where every story he'd told had started to unravel. The call came through on a Tuesday morning. The detective needed to see Joseph again, and this time it wasn't a request. The interview room looked the same. Small, windowless, a table between 2 chairs. But everything that mattered had changed since the last time he'd sat there. They had a body now, a crime scene, recordings of Joseph threatening to kill. And something Joseph didn't know, he'd left behind evidence in his boot tread, connecting him to the exact spot where his wife had been buried. The detective sat across from Joseph and laid it out. The needles in your boot, they came from a tree standing 3 feet from where we found her. Joseph's answer came slower this time. I don't know how that would have gotten there. The tree knows, the detective said. DNA doesn't forget what touched it. There it was. The moment Joseph realized he was being told something he couldn't argue with. Not a timeline he could adjust. Not a recording he could reinterpret. Not a witness he could discredit. A tree. A specific tree. Standing exactly where Mengqi's grave had been dug. And Joseph's boot had carried pieces of it away. Preserved in rubber grooves, waiting to be matched through genetic analysis he'd never anticipated. He paused longer between answers now. The careful composure he'd maintained through weeks of questioning started to show cracks, because there was no story that explained this. No version of events where he'd accidentally picked up juniper needles from that clearing without being exactly where the detective said he'd been. No innocent reason his boots would carry DNA from a tree growing over his wife's grave. Recordings could be misinterpreted. Timelines could be confused. DNA from a specific tree could not. The detective kept going. The boots seized from his closet, the plant material extracted, the DNA sequencing matching it to one tree among thousands. The tree that stood beside the spot where Mengqi had been found. You told us you'd been driving around to relax, the detective said. 5 hours, with Anna in the back seat, through areas you said helped you think. Joseph nodded, still trying to maintain the story. Rock Bridge Memorial State Park. You mentioned it in your statement, said you'd been there before. Another nod. The tree that touched your boot is in that park, standing exactly where we found her. So when you said you'd been driving around to relax, were you relaxing, or were you making sure no one had found what you'd buried? Joseph's pause stretched longer. The kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they're out of moves. His carefully rehearsed confusion had no line for botanical DNA evidence. No explanation for how needles from a specific tree could end up in his boot unless he'd stood exactly where the evidence said he'd stood. The next conversation would be the one he couldn't talk his way out of. The one where every contradiction, Every recording, every juniper needle would be laid on the table between them. And this time, the detective would ask the question directly. That direct question started with the simplest one. Why? The detective leaned forward and asked Joseph to walk him through the drive one more time, starting with why. Not where, not when. Why? Why a man whose wife had just vanished would load a 1-year-old into a car and drive for 5 hours through rural.
She was a great mother the whole way. Yeah, I really miss her and I need her back, so I think she'll come back, but I hope she's safe.
Giving this TV interview is 24-year-old university student Joseph Elledge.
Mengqi's mother sat across from a victim services coordinator in an office with fluorescent lights and generic furniture. A tissue box on the desk. Forms waiting to quantify loss. The coordinator offered resources, grief counselling, travel assistance, victim compensation forms with boxes to check and dollar amounts. None of them addressed what was actually taken. Through a translator, Mengqi's mother asked questions that had no answers in any language. How do you parent a ghost? What do you tell a granddaughter about the mother she'll never remember? Mengqi would have been 29 by sentencing. Anna would have had a mother. Instead, she had a father in prison and grandparents who would have to explain why. The coordinator handed over pamphlets, a card with a number to call, as if questions were the problem. Outside the courthouse, news crews packed up equipment. The story had its ending. Guilty verdict, lengthy sentence, case closed. Reporters would file final updates. The volunteers who'd searched would return to their lives. But one question remained unresolved. What happens now to Anna, the child at the center of it all, raised for 2 years by the father who killed her mother, now in temporary care while custody arrangements formalized? Both sets of grandparents wanted her. Courts would decide where a child belongs when her mother is dead and her father is in prison for murder. The sentence was final. What happened to Anna was not. Anna lives in 2 languages now, 2 countries, 2 versions of the family tree with a missing branch. The custody arrangement split her life the way the case split everything else. School years with Joseph's parents in Missouri, summers with Mengqi's parents in China. A childhood divided between the family that raised her mother's killer and the family that lost their only daughter. She exists in the gap between worlds, carries a mother she cannot remember and a father she will not see outside prison until adulthood. Her maternal grandparents teach her Mandarin and show her photos of Mengqi. Her paternal grandparents explain how the man in prison is both her father and her mother's killer. No arrangement could make that math work. Anna inherited a life built on absence, the space where Mengqi should have been. The verdict closed the case. Anna's life measures the cost. What happened in the hours before dawn on October 10, 2019, will never be fully known. Joseph is the only person who could say, and he never has. The plea agreement meant no trial testimony, no cross-examination, no moment where prosecutors could walk him through the weapon, the sequence, the decision point where threats became action. The investigation reconstructed movements. The timeline placed Mengqi's death in their apartment while Anna slept nearby. The medical examiner determined blunt force trauma. The recordings captured escalating threats. But the precise moment, the words spoken, whether Mengqi saw it coming, those details stayed buried with Joseph's silence. He accepted responsibility. He never explained how or why. Some truths stay buried even when the body does not. Investigators proved Joseph killed Mengqi, proved he drove her to Rockbridge Memorial State Park, proved he dug a grave off a logging road, proved he lied while search parties combed the forest where he'd left her. What they couldn't prove was the moment between the last threat and the first shovel of dirt. That gap is where Mengqi's family lives now. Not just mourning, but imagining. Every scenario unbearable. None confirmed. Rockbridge Memorial State Park, where Joseph proposed to Mengqi years earlier, became the place he chose to bury her. A beginning and an ending in the same soil. The place where he'd asked her to marry him became the place he tried to hide what he'd done. But the forest kept what he tried to erase. Soil samples, root growth through remains, DNA in creek water, juniper needles in his car matching the trees surrounding the clearing. The land became evidence. Nature testified. Joseph thought he could bury the truth with Mengqi's body. Instead, the forest preserved both.
Like it's sad though that I have no interest in my husband.
Every biological process that decomposed her remains created the forensic trail leading back to him. The earth remembered. The trees left their fingerprint. He chose the site. The land chose justice. Mengqi Ji came to Missouri to study, to build a life, to raise a daughter. She documented the threats because she knew they were escalating. She pressed record because she understood the danger. The evidence convicted her killer, but it didn't save her life. He chose the place where he proposed to bury what he had done, but the forest refused to keep his secret. In the end, the land testified louder than silence ever could. This is where Mengqi Ji's story ends in the records, with a conviction, a sentence, and a daughter left to piece together a life from the fragments. Mengqi came to Missouri to study, to build a future, to raise her daughter in safety. She documented the threats because she understood the danger she was in. She pressed record because she knew evidence might be the only voice she'd have left.
Yeah, because I have a job to do. My job is to find Mengqi, right? I understand. Yep. For good or for bad, it's to find.
That's the tragedy of domestic violence. Documentation can bring justice after, but it doesn't prevent the violence itself.
I mean, Mengqi and I have been really distant the past couple months.
And it's about understanding that evidence matters. Journals, recordings, photos, telling someone you trust. Mengqi did everything right. She documented. She tried to protect herself. The system still failed her while she was alive. We owe it to her memory and to everyone facing similar danger to do better. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, respectfully, as always. And if you know someone who might need to hear this message about recognizing the signs of domestic violence, please share this story with them. Thank you for listening with me today. I know these stories aren't easy to hear, but they're important to tell. Before we close, this story is based on a real case.
You got to relax. Your wife is missing. You're now the sole caregiver of a 1-year-old child. And you went on a relaxing drive?
My deepest respect goes to Mengqi Ji's family and to everyone who loved her. Her memory deserves more than silence.